morning from a very cold Gauteng. I'm going to just review with you today stops and starts. Let's have a look at what we do. The first method I'm going to show you is using your tie off function on your machine. And this works for whether we are working on frames or sit downs. And this is a method that I normally use a lot. I don't necessarily sew away threads or work away threads, but we are going to look at that option as well. So we're going to start by dropping our needle, raising it so that we can pull on the top thread tail and therefore bring up the bobbin thread. Then you want to grab hold of your bobbin thread and you're going to move right back to the position where you dropped your needle to start with. And I'm putting my finger down here to kind of stop the machine. So what I'm doing is I'm actually pushing down on the ruler base or on the base of the machine a bit so that the machine doesn't move away for whatever reason. And what I'm also going to do is move the machine ever so slightly with my finger, because what we are aiming to achieve is not a bunch of stitches right on top of each other that forms a big knot. And eventually when you try and trim threads away, that knot will be cut and your work will start to unravel. What we are aiming for is, if you visualize the weave of the fabric, these are the fibers that goes crosswise, the warp and the width, right? What we are wanting to do is to be able to place our needle in between these fibers. That's how close we are wanting to stitch our starts and stops. So we are going to move the machine ever so slightly so that we don't end up with all of those stitches right on top of one another, but next to one another. Now, if you've done any normal type of sewing, any clothing for instance, and you would know that sometimes when your machine gets stuck a little bit or the foot hooks on something and you end up standing nearly still in one place and your machine stitches a whole bunch of these extremely tiny stitches, you will know from experience that you cannot unpick those stitches. They are tied in there and they are stuck. They won't go anywhere. And the same thing happens with our quilting. So this is my preferred method. I do this for 99.999% of all quilts. This is how I stop and start. So I typically run on a regulated cruise mode of 200 stitches per minute, the cruise idle speed, and a stitch length of 12 stitches per inch. And I'm just going to use my start button. Start my machine because my machine will be idling, and as it idles I'm going to move it ever so slightly, and I'm moving it into the direction that I will be quilting. So I am not going to start here and then do my tie off stitch or my starting stitches in this direction only to backtrack over it and carry on quilting in the opposite direction, because that's exactly what's going to happen. You'll have a bulk up of stitches. So what I'm trying to always do is, if I'm going to be sewing in this direction, my starting point, I will be doing my tie off or my start up stitches in that direction so I can continue stitching in that direction. Now the number of stitches I aim for is no less than 6 or 7 stitches. I try to go for about 8 so that we can secure these tails absolutely in place. And then you can stitch on whatever you need to stitch on. Now those stitches are secured and I can clip the tail. The same way we're going to end is just in reverse. So I'm stopping where I need to stop and still continuing in the direction that I was stitching, and I'm going to do my 7 or 8 stitches right next to one another, moving my machine ever so slightly. Then I'm going to raise the needle. I'm going to move my machine away about 3 to 4 inches. If you're on a sit-down machine, you're going to move your quilt away 3 to 4 inches, grab hold of your top thread, move your machine back to that spot where you ended, the very last stitch, drop needle, raise needle, and when you move your machine away, your bobbin thread will pull up. Then I grab hold of both, and I literally do that with my 2 fingers on my non-dominant hand, and I kind of give the yarn a little bit of a tug. So it tugs that last stitch into the quilt, and I can clip my thread, and that should stay secure. If you have, for whatever reason, doubt that it will, then you can always just drop a tiny drop of prim fray check on those ends. I normally just do it from the back if I do feel like there's going to be a problem with that stop and start. But the key with this is that you want to make sure that it's enough stitches, even if it's a little bit more than 8 stitches. Now when you use your stop start function, or your tie off function on your machine, the maximum that you can set it to is 8 stitches. So let's just pull out our bobbin thread, and using the tie off function again, I'm going to do the same thing. I am holding my finger in place so that I'm moving my dominant hand over to my tie off function, which I'm going to press, and the moment I'm going to start moving my machine, the tie off will start happening. And again, I'm moving my machine ever so slightly so that I don't end up with all of those tie off stitches in one place. Stitch on until you are done. Do your tie off. Raise needle, move away 4 or 5 inches, 3 to 5 inches, come back, drop needle in the last position of the stitch, raise needle, bring bobbin thread up, and I give it a little tug like that, and I clip it off. Okay, stitch is secured. Now let's look at, if you don't want to do this option, if you do want to do sewing away of the threads with needles, then we also have 2 tips for you. Number 1, I'm just going to do a start here, grab hold of my thread, and I'm holding onto my thread when I start. I don't want that bobbin thread or the top thread lying too loose when you start quilting, because there's a risk that the one will get pulled down suddenly to the bottom and form a bird's nest. So always bring up your bobbin thread to the top. It's just a habit that makes everything so much easier in the long run if you fall into a good habit from the start. Bring your bobbin thread up, and then you don't have tidying up to do on your quilt afterwards. And then I hold on to my stitches before I start to do my quilting. Okay, then raise needle, carefully move away your machine, come back and do the same action. Bring that bobbin thread up first. Now I am going to, on purpose, cut this tail short. And here we have a proper long tail that we can sew away. Okay? So we're just going to give it a knot, tie the bobbin and the upper thread into a fine overhand knot, give it a light tug, and then we can use self-threading needles, or we can use a spiral eye needle. Spiral eye needle has got it's basically a self-threader, but the opening sits on the side of the needle, and I can just hook the thread around and in, and I don't have to struggle to see what I'm doing. And now, because if you float your quilt tops, there's a benefit. I can really just put my hand underneath. Let me just make sure I don't use the vision, and I can drop my needle into that last stitch, feed it through in the middle between the layers. So you want the needle to run in the batting, not pop all the way through to the back. And I put my non-dominant hand, my finger, just underneath the needle, so it helps me to rock the needle back out and pull. Give it a slight tug. If you didn't hear the knot pull in, slight tug, and the knot will pull into your fabric. Now hold on to your tail Don't pull it to death, but just hold on to it. Use a nice sharp point, preferably a scissor with a bent blade, so that you don't accidentally cut your quilt. And then I push down on the quilt, cut thread, and a thread tail pops into the quilt. It is a very neat finish, but again, as everything else in life, 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. Do we need the absolute neatness of this, or do we need speed and time? You need to weigh up your options. Now let's say for whatever reason you have a thread tail that's very short like this, you accidentally cut it too short, or the thread broke. Then what you can use is basically a lasso. So you take a normal sewing away thread, a sewing away needle, and you make a little lasso loop that threads through the needle and stays on there. Now you are going to pop your needle, and again I just want to make sure I'm not losing you in terms of view. Pop your needle in where you need that last stitch, rock it through the batting, and pull some of it through. And I prefer to pull the knot through first before I try and pull the threads through. There we go, knots in between already. And now what you can just do is, I always have a handy dandy tweezer hanging on my apron. You are now just going to pop these two short tails through the lasso loop and pull your loop through. And did you see? Voila! The lasso pulled your short tails through your fabric. And you can grab hold of those tails, clip, and they pop back. So these items I just keep on my needle bar, on my handlebar in the little spongy handle grips, if I know that I'm going to be sewing away thread tails. And I keep them there, they're handy, you can do them on the go, and you don't have any work that you need to revisit once you're done with your quilting. I hope this helps you. Like I said at the beginning, go and try the methods. Each has its own place and each works in its own way. Find the way that you like doing and flow with it. Happy quilting!